On August 1st, 2025, President Trump builds a new wall, not of concrete, but of tariffs. A staggering 50% duty on copper imports is designed to protect American industry. But in less than 24 hours, the move backfires catastrophically. In a stunning act of economic retaliation, Canada halts all copper exports to the United States, vaporizing a $4.2 billion supply chain overnight. Copper prices spike 13% to a record high, sending shockwaves through the U.S. economy. How did a move designed to shield American industry trigger a self-inflicted crisis in a single day? For a century, the economic relationship between the United States and Canada was built on a simple, powerful synergy. Canada was a treasure trove of the raw materials the world needed, and the United States was the industrial behemoth that could turn them into modern life. This connection was forged in the earth itself, in the copper, iron, and timber that flowed south in a predictable stream. It was the bedrock of a continental partnership that built cities, powered industries, and created millions of jobs on both sides of the border. But this foundation of trust and mutual benefit was systematically dismantled by the ideology of America First. The Trump administration began to view this deep integration not as a strength, but as a weakness. The steady flow of Canadian resources was reframed as a threat to American jobs and industry. The first cracks in the relationship appeared with the tariffs on steel and aluminum, moves that treated America's closest and most reliable supplier like a hostile adversary. This wasn't just a policy dispute, it was a fundamental betrayal of the century-old partnership. The era of predictable cooperation was over, replaced by a new reality of confrontation and economic warfare, setting the stage for an even more reckless and damaging confrontation. On July 9, 2025, the Trump administration dropped an economic bomb. It announced a staggering 50% tariff on all copper imports, set to take effect in just 3 weeks. The stated goal was classic America First protectionism, to shield the domestic copper industry from foreign competition and encourage production at home. It was a move sold to the American public as a way to bring back jobs and revitalize a core American industry. But behind the populist rhetoric was a fatal flaw, a willful ignorance of basic economic reality. The United States simply does not produce enough copper to meet its own needs. The country's own data shows a massive supply deficit. American smelters produce roughly 1.1 million tons of refined copper, but American factories consume over 1.6 million tons. That 500,000 ton gap is the lifeblood of U.S. manufacturing, and a huge portion of it is filled by one country, Canada. The 50% tariff was not a surgical tool of policy. It was a sledgehammer wielded with no regard for the consequences. The administration was operating under the hubristic assumption that Canada, as the smaller partner, would have no choice but to absorb the cost. They believed Ottawa would complain, perhaps threaten a lawsuit, but ultimately continue to ship its copper south because it had no other choice. It was a colossal miscalculation. The policy was not designed to work in the real world. It was designed to project strength and to bully an ally into submission. It was a move that ignored the deep integration of the North American economy and treated the supply chain not as a shared asset, but as a political hostage. The White House had just lit a fuse on a crisis, seemingly unaware or unconcerned that the explosion would happen in its own backyard. Washington was expecting a protest. What it got was a revolution. On August 1st, the day the US tariffs went into effect, Canada responded with a move of stunning and brutal simplicity. It didn't announce a counter tariff. It didn't file a complaint with the WTO. It simply turned off the tap. In a coordinated action, the Canadian government and its copper industry halted all shipments of copper to the United States. It was one of the most dramatic acts of economic retaliation in the history of the North American partnership. In less than 24 hours, a $4.2 billion supply chain that is essential to U.S. manufacturing simply vanished. The impact was instantaneous and catastrophic. On the COMEX exchange in New York, the price of copper futures exploded, spiking 13% overnight to an all-time record high. This was not just a retaliatory measure, it was a strategic masterstroke. A counter tariff would have simply made Canadian copper more expensive for American buyers. By halting exports entirely, Canada transformed the problem for the US from one of price to one of availability. You can't pay a 50% tariff on something that doesn't exist. Ottawa was sending a clear and powerful message to the White House. You have mistaken our reliability for weakness. You treat our most essential exports as a political threat, so we will remind you that they are a strategic necessity. Canada was weaponizing America's own domestic supply deficit, turning the very dependency the US ignored into a tool of economic warfare. The move was a declaration of sovereignty, a defiant refusal to be a passive victim in a trade war it did not start. This left President Trump in an impossible position, one reportedly sparking rage and panic within the administration. His signature policy, designed to make him look strong, had backfired in less than a day, creating an immediate and severe crisis for the very industries he claimed to be protecting. The 50% tariff was now a monument to his own miscalculation, a tax on nothing. To rescind it would be a humiliating public admission of defeat. To leave it in place would be to preside over a supply chain collapse and a price surge that could cripple US manufacturing and send inflation soaring. He had started a fight he couldn't win, trapped by a decisive and devastating counterpunch from an ally he had fatally underestimated. For a company that makes electrical wiring in the American Midwest, copper isn't just a raw material, it's everything. Their entire business is built on a steady, predictable, and affordable supply of it. For years, that supply has come from just across the border in Canada, delivered just in time to keep their factory humming and their American workers employed. On August 1st, 2025, their world was turned upside down. The 50% tariff they had been dreading was suddenly the least of their problems. Their Canadian supplier called, not to discuss a new price, but to tell them the shipments had stopped completely. The immediate result was chaos. Their production lines were starved of their essential ingredient. The price of any domestic or non-Canadian copper they could find had skyrocketed overnight, wiping out their profit margins instantly. The company was left with a set of impossible choices. They could halt production entirely and issue layoff notices to the very workers the tariff was supposed to protect. They could try to absorb the massive price increase and operate at a catastrophic loss, burning through their cash reserves in weeks. Or they could try to pass the cost on to their customers, who build everything from new homes to electric vehicles, making American-made goods more expensive and less competitive. This is the brutal, on-the-ground reality of the trade war. The policy designed in Washington to shield American industry was now actively strangling it, sacrificing real American jobs and businesses on the altar of political optics. While Canada's decision to halt copper exports was a stunning strategic victory, it was not without a heavy price. For the thousands of Canadians who work in the nation's copper mines, the United States isn't a geopolitical rival, it's the customer. The mining towns of British Columbia and Ontario are built on this relationship. The high-paying union jobs at the mine support the local grocery store, the car dealership, and the kids' hockey teams. The health of their entire community is tied directly to the demand from American factories. When the government made the difficult decision to turn off the tap, it was these workers and their families who were standing on the front lines. The impact was immediate. With their primary market suddenly gone, mining companies were forced to scale back production. Shifts were cut, overtime vanished, and lucrative contracts for trucking and supply companies were put on hold indefinitely. While many workers understood and supported their government's defiant stance, they were the ones who bore the direct economic cost of the fight. Their financial security was sacrificed for the sake of national sovereignty. It's the tragic paradox of a trade war. Even when you're winning the strategic battle, your own people are often the first casualties. A reckless tariff, met with a devastating counterpunch, has pushed the North American economy into uncharted territory. A policy designed to protect American industry has instead starved it of a vital resource, while a Canadian act of sovereignty has put its own workers in the line of fire. The deeply integrated supply chain that once created shared prosperity has been turned into a weapon, leaving both nations to absorb the high cost of a trade war with no clear victor. In the race to define the future, will North America win together, or will both nations lose by trying to go it alone? Are you American or Canadian? Share your story and your perspective in the comments below.